Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much to CIMIC and to Freund for inviting me to visit Japan and to have many meetings that were very interesting with PMDA and with several companies, and to do this seminar today. I'm very happy to be here. It's, I believe, the fourth time I'm in Japan, and it gets nicer and more interesting every time I come. So I look forward to a good discussion today. I will give you a talk that has roughly 3 pieces in it. The first part of the talk is a description of the overall landscape, the overall situation in the US regarding continuous and advanced manufacturing. Yes? Then we will switch gears and we will talk about what are the important steps required to implement continuous manufacturing. Okay, thank you. And then the third topic will be how we can do that quickly. How can we accelerate the implementation of continuous manufacturing processes? So starting with the first topic, what's going on in the USA regarding advanced manufacturing, regarding continuous manufacturing. So after COVID, the American government became very aware that that is very risky to be importing more than 80% of all pharmaceutical materials and substances, and that the US needs to make sure that there is a very secure supply chain for pharmaceuticals. During COVID, we had the experience of having medicines in shortage. That continues to be the case. There are several hundred medicines in shortage in the US. Many of those shortages, about 60% of those shortages, are assigned to quality issues. The percentage could be higher. And also, there is a concern that if there is another pandemic or another major medical emergency, we're going to be ready to respond much, much faster. These topics are all interconnected. You cannot talk about one of these things without very quickly talking about several other of these topics. And in general, there is a consensus in the US, in many government organizations, and also in a large fraction of the US industry, that advanced manufacturing in general, continuous manufacturing in particular, is very important to achieve these things. And we will hear why, some of the reasons why. I will share with you why continuous manufacturing is important to improving quality, addressing shortages, responding to emergencies, and overall being able to implement manufacturing processes at lower cost, which would make them sustainable. Now, this has been now a priority of 3 successive US administrations, and I'll have more data about that, but let me set the stage. So this is a copy of an FDA slide from a few years ago. FDA distinguished between batch manufacturing, the traditional manufacturing, to hybrid manufacturing, which is what we have mostly implemented, where you have a segment, perhaps for API, that is a batch process, and then in another factory, in another city, or in another building of the same plant, you have the finished product manufacturing, and this could be integrated as a continuous process. Yes? To my knowledge, every single commercial process that has been implemented up to now is of this kind. At the same time that we were developing this process approach, MIT was developing this process approach. Funded by Novartis, they embarked on a much more difficult proposition, which was to put together a single manufacturing line where you could make the API, purify the API, and then compound it into a finished product, all in a single process. The interest in this approach has continued. We have also started working on this approach in the last few years. We're working together with CIMIC on this. In our case, we are doing this for injectable products, not for solid dose, at least not yet. this has some uses and some applications, but I will predict that we will continue to see what I prefer to call segmented manufacturing, where some parts are batch because that's the right technology, some parts are continuous because that's the right technology, and it's not a matter of dogma, it's a matter of what actually gives the best quality at the lowest cost. Yes, and each product is different, and we should be very intelligent in selecting the approach. Now, I know that there is some concerns about whether continuous manufacturing is losing momentum. I don't believe it is. This is data from a couple of years ago showing that the emerging technology team of the FDA had accepted already 46 files for the consultative regulatory process that will eventually lead to full applications at FDA. So this is a large number if you think about how many products are approved per year by FDA, and the great majority of all applications are here, right? This is all the advanced manufacturing applications, but the great majority is here. And this is the number of finished product approvals attributed to advanced manufacturing, and you can see that they are talking about advanced manufacturing, but continuous manufacturing is by far the most important component of that. Okay? So my prediction is that within 2 to 3 years, we're going to see maybe 20 approved products, maybe 30 approved products, and I don't see the interest decreasing. So I want to show you the work we've done. So in the US and in Europe, approximately 80% of all the products that are manufactured by continuous manufacturing are manufactured in direct compression systems that typically have feeders in one level, then a blender in the next level, and then the tablet press in the lower level. And hopefully my movie runs, yes. So you can appreciate this cartoon that we drew, 4 feeders in the top, we put another feeder in the middle for lubricant. Going into a blender here is a very small blender. Going to the tablet press, this line is about 7 meters tall, and it occupies a very small space of about, I would say, maybe 4 meters by 4 meters. But it has a nominal capacity of 2 billion tablets a year. So one of the big advantages of continuous manufacturing is that it can save a lot of money because it uses very little space, and GMP space is very expensive. Now, this is a cartoon, but here is the photograph of the line we built. We built this line in 2009, 2010, has the feeders going into the blender, going into the tablet press, and we built it in 15 months, and that included not only bringing all the equipment together, but actually doing the complete integration of hardware, sensors, and all the software necessary to operate the entire system from a single laptop. Yeah? So that is achievable. And in this line, we demonstrated the many advantages that were anticipated for continuous manufacturing. We have published many papers on this. You can find them. I only want to talk about one of these many advantages that I think is very important, and that is the first one. The fact that we can develop products very quickly in continuous manufacturing. That's important for emergency response. That's also very important for reshoring. If we're going to bring back hundreds of products to the US, we need to develop them quickly. And obviously, that's also important for profits. If you develop faster, you can get to the market faster, right? FDA published a study not too long ago where they look at the regulatory process for the 6 first approvals, and they concluded that they were the first 6 products that were to be developed using continuous manufacturing were approved 3 to 5 months faster than regular batch processes, and that the companies that basically sponsored those applications made between 170 and 530 million US additional in revenue because of that accelerated approval, and that doesn't take into account additional benefits from getting to the market faster, beating the competition, capturing market share, and all those other reasons, yes? So it became clear that the biggest incentive from a business perspective is getting to market faster, developing faster, getting an approval faster. Okay, with that in mind, why is it faster? So this is the typical approach used in batch. Develop the formulation in a benchtop, develop a process, first process, draft also on benchtop, iterate, each different composition, you have to make a batch and you have to test it, and it takes like a week or several days. And if you go through 20 or 30 possibilities in composition, and then look at process parameters, you spend several months doing this. Then you scale up, and maybe you run into some trouble, and have to come back here and do some more small-scale development, and you are developing your analytical methods here, so you can only make a few batches for analytical development. Usually you vary the API level and maybe a couple of things. And then you go to validation, and hopefully it works, but if it doesn't, back. Our experience is that this takes 12 to 15 months, very commonly, sometimes longer, yeah? Continuous manufacturing, very different. So, when the powder, and this is direct compression, the story is similar for other forms of continuous manufacturing, but for direct compression, which is the most common type, the powder leaves the feeder, travels through the blender, comes out as tablets in about 6 to 7 minutes. And I can wait 10 minutes for my line to achieve steady state, and I can collect my samples, and then I decide, okay, now I'm going to try another tablet with a different amount of a lubricant. So I send the signal. Within a second, I'm providing a different amount of lubricant. I wait my 7 minutes. Now I'm making tablets with that different amount of lubricant. If I wait 10 minutes to reach steady state and collect samples, 17 minutes later, I did another experiment. How long does it take to make a batch using a batch process? Here I can do that in less than 20 minutes. Let's say that my design of experiments requires making 30 different compositions and varying process parameters, right? I might want to make some of those compositions at higher throughput or lower throughput, or using a different feed frame, speed, or, varying the CPPs. I can combine changing composition with changing process parameters, and if I already have developed my PAT, while I do those 30 experiments, I am collecting immense amounts of information using the sensors, and I can go through a 30-point DOE in this system in 2 days. We've done this many times. Then I analyze all that data, and maybe I come back to the line and say, I want to run a second DOE because I want to refine my process, understand better my model, so I spend another day or two. Yeah? So in a couple of weeks, I can do the equivalent of a year worth of work in a batch system, so that I run this DOE and I'm optimizing simultaneously my formulation, my process, and my analytical methods. If I have the same equipment in GMP manufacturing that I use for development, because that's another big advantage of continuous manufacturing, we develop at scale. There is no real scale up. There is running longer or shorter, but we can use the same equipment. I can transfer to the GMP line using the mirror line concept in a couple of weeks, maybe less. And so in about 6 weeks, I can go from powder to making clinical supplies. Then the FDA will review that faster, and this really leads to great acceleration, and this is the reason why some companies like Vertex has adopted continuous manufacturing. The main driver was the faster development. Yes? So, this has initiated and created a lot of interest in the US. Our funding initially from the National Science Foundation, which started in 2006. I had been working on continuous manufacturing since 1998. But in 2006, we received $40 million from the National Science Foundation to create this kind of technology, and industry came in and contributed another $60 million. So we ran a 10-year, $100 million program, and that was recognized by the Obama administration as a critical emerging technology. And then on the president that came after Obama, there was another executive order telling all the federal agencies to support advanced manufacturing. And then President Biden also issued another executive order, and there's been large amounts of money going to companies to implement these, like, for example, this company called Flow that received a lot of money to implement continuous manufacturing of drug substances. And since then, there's been many other actions. It's not just the FDA. FDA has put money into this. The big money is not coming from FDA. The big money is coming from Economic Development Agency or from National Science Foundation, or more recently and most importantly, from the military. The US is looking at this problem of the pharmaceutical supply chain as a national security issue. Okay? So I think this interest will continue until we see a lot of implementation. Now, more recently, about almost 2 years ago, there was a law that was passed that required FDA to create what is called an Advanced Manufacturing Technology Designation Program. Under this law, FDA had 1 year to issue a draft guidance, 2 years to issue a final guidance, basically creating a new program where companies can go to FDA and say to FDA, I have this technology, it's a new technology, it can achieve the goals required here. I want an official designation from FDA that this is an advanced manufacturing technology. And so they define what is an advanced manufacturing technology for the purpose of this law. So it's a technology that accelerates development and improves the drug supply. And it's new. Hasn't been used in previous filings. Okay? And if you have a technology that receives this designation from FDA, then FDA is required to review any product made using that technology faster. So they have put into law now this big incentive that if you use advanced manufacturing, they'll review your application faster, and that translates into many millions of dollars in additional revenue and many millions of dollars in avoided manufacturing costs. Here is the carátula, the first page of the draft guidance. You see the issue date, December 23. In December 24, we will have the final guidance. Yeah? No mysteries, I believe. I think we know what it's going to say. And we're already working with many other partners to create these advanced manufacturing technologies that FDA can designate and then industry can use to achieve faster review. Okay? So in our view, advanced manufacturing is a little bit more than just accelerating things and being able to make it more reliably. So we define advanced manufacturing processes as processes that can be designed predictably, that can be automated, that can be optimized, that can be scaled up, and that are easily transferred because we understand them well enough, right? So a high level of automation. So when we apply this to solid dose manufacturing, we use 5 technical components. We need to understand the material properties. We need to be able to model the process, mainly for design, but mainly for process control. We need to be able to use sensors to monitor what's happening. We need to implement process and quality control, and we need to be able to integrate the whole thing, the hardware, the sensors, and the software to operate as a single system. Now, we have done this several times for solid dose products, but recently we started doing it for other kinds of products like API, or injectables, or biologics, or even 3D printing. And what you learn is that these 5 subjects, these 5 capabilities, are always the same. You might vary what kind of sensor you're using, you might vary how you characterize the material, but you still need to do these 5 things to implement the system. And so we have created tools and toolboxes, material property databases, model libraries, methods for real-time quality control so we can achieve quality by control, and methods to integrate. And of all of these, the most difficult part of all of this is integration. Where most of the mistakes are made, where most of the problems emerge, is in how to integrate all the manufacturing equipment, all the PAT instrumentation, and all of the software required to gather the data, understand the data, and use it for process and quality control. That is the hard part of this. Okay? Now, many times we bring industry colleagues into our laboratories so that we can work together on projects, so that they can gain the experience of how a fully integrated system works. We have developed products in our lines that then were used in commercial filings. So there is a capability in place to work with industry, to help industry implement these systems. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So what does it mean then, right? So what most people are familiar with is, okay, the feeders, and maybe use a mill, and then you have a blender, and you go into the tablet press, and you have a continuous manufacturing system. This is a direct compression system. I'm keeping it simple here, right? Because if I do the wet granulation or roller compaction system, I need many more pictures on the screen, right? Do I have a continuous process? No. What I have is a bunch of equipment that has been connected, but it will not operate as an automated continuous process. For that, I need to put in place my sensors so that I can monitor what my process is doing. And then I need to implement all of the local level controls into a single integrated supervisory control system that can read the data from the PAT and can tell the controllers what to do. And as I said, this last step, and here I'm showing Emerson Delta V or Siemens PCS7, I could use Pharma MB, I'm sure that there are other platforms that could be used here. Getting everything to work is the hardest part. And there's been many failures in the past. There's been companies that took 2-3 years to finalize this step. So I want everybody to get a clear message that this is not to be underestimated. This is where you will need to spend a significant amount of money and a very significant amount of time making sure that that works. Okay? Now, to implement a system requires several steps. I used to have 12 steps here. I have simplified the list. As we do this more and more, we find more things that we maybe can do more efficiently. But the most important first step is the conceptual design. What are the right products? I'll talk about each step later, so I don't want to repeat everything twice. So let me go through the steps quickly. So the conceptual design of your process. How are you going to characterize the materials to make sure that the materials are appropriate for your process? Specification of all of the unit operations, the actual manufacturing equipment, the development and implementation of all of the PAT methods, examine the performance for proof of principle, design and implement the quality control architecture, and finally verify that the system works for proof of concept. So I'll talk about each of these steps briefly. Conceptual design is where many failures happen from the beginning. What is the right product? What are the right formulations that are best manufactured using continuous manufacturing? If you have more than 7 or 8 ingredients, that's a clue that might not be the right product. If you have very, very low dose, that will make it difficult. If you have a very high dose, that could also be difficult, right? So there are some constraints. So I always recommend a company that is getting into continuous manufacturing to choose a simple technology and a relatively simple product to make first, because that's how you gain the experience, that's how you hire the right people, that's how you create the strength within the company to do this later on for more complicated products or more complicated processes. Now, what kind of manufacturing process are you going to do? Wet granulation, direct compression, roller compaction, melt granulation, which I think is going to emerge as another variation on the methodology. Are you building a dedicated line for just one product, or are you building a line that you want to use for a lot of different products? That's different. How much sensing and process control will you implement? Yes? And are you going to use residence time distribution modeling for process control? Understanding the right answers to these questions is important because it determines to some significant extent whether you will fail or succeed. And I have seen many failures. I've seen companies build very complicated, very big lines, and then they never use it for commercial manufacturing. I'm not going to name any names, but there has been failures, significant failures, and the failures started here. We did not take the time to understand what are we doing and why are we doing it, and what is the right way to do it. So, very important to do this step properly. Then, characterize material properties. The key material properties in continuous manufacturing can be a little different than in batch. Yeah? And the best materials for a continuous manufacturing process are not necessarily the same as the best materials in batch. The powders need to flow. They need to flow well. Whether you're doing direct compression, roller compaction, or wet granulation, your ingredients need to flow, because if they don't flow, you cannot feed them. And if you cannot feed them, you cannot make product. Yes? What to measure? We're very familiar with measuring particle size, with measuring density, less familiar by getting there and measuring powder flow, not very familiar at all with measuring electrostatics. Electrostatics in continuous manufacturing is very, very important. In batch manufacturing, not so much. Yeah? So the outcome of this step is to create a systematic program for characterizing your materials. And we have built a very large material property database. We have more than 300 powders in our database. That saves a lot of time, helps us choose ingredients, helps us design systems, and our database will continue to grow as we do more projects and characterize more materials. Now, how do we decide which properties to measure? This took some time to understand. So this is again the cartoon of my direct compression line. A few feeders, maybe a mill, the blender, the tablet press. So the first question is, what are the failure modes in a line like this? And we found 7 main failure modes, and this list of 7 has remained stable for about 15 years. So we think it's a very good list, right? Can you feed ingredients? Can you reduce the variability as you feed to achieve good, control of composition? Will you have agglomerates after the feeder, after the mill, after the blender? Are the blend properties of the blend good enough to make product? Will you reach your target hardness? Will you reach your target dissolution? Yeah? Some are common to batch, some not so much. Now that I understand the failure modes, question number 2 is, how do I diagnose those failure modes? So there are some responses that tell me, yes, I have a problem with flow, or no, I don't have a problem with flow. Yes, I have agglomerates, or, there are some things I can measure in my process that tell me whether any of these failure modes is a threat to my process. And once I understand the failure modes, question number 3 is, which material properties predict the failure modes based on the observable behavior? And there is a list of material properties that translate into these observations and predict these failure modes. So when we screen a powder, we go through these material properties, and eventually we build a large material property database. If you don't do that, you have surprises like this, where this powder is a very electrostatic and sticks to, in this case, the discharge of the feeder or the discharge of the blender, and coats the screws in the feeder, and that could force you to have to stop your process. Or you might find agglomerates in your blend, because when this breaks, it makes big pieces of agglomerated material. One of these powders is microcrystalline cellulose. The other powder is acetaminophen. Just to tell you that these are not strange materials that we hardly ever use. Some of the most common materials we use would have this behavior. There are ways to solve these problems. There are solutions for these problems, but you first have to know that you have a problem. So we measure a lot of the electrostatic behavior. We have several techniques to measure the electrostatic behavior. We also measure compressibility, flow function. These tell us how well the powder flows and how well it behaves. And we also measure wetting properties. And sometimes the wetting properties change and the material becomes over-lubricated, and now the tablet doesn't dissolve anymore. So we need to understand these behaviors, and we have methods to do that. And once you have a big material property database, you can use things like principal component analysis to answer a 4th question. Do I really need to measure 22 properties? Or maybe, as is the case here, there are 3 properties or 3 measurements that give me 5 properties that actually give me, in this case, 85% of all of the variability. Yeah? and that saves a lot of time and effort as well. Now, the third step is specifying and characterizing the unit operations, right? That depends on what unit operations you're going to have. Feeders, blenders, granulators, mills, feed frame of the tablet press, the compaction stage of the tablet press, coating, etc. It's important to create a performance database so that over time, when you have a material property database and a performance database, you begin to be able to predict performance based on material properties. Yeah? Included here, I didn't remember to bring a slide for this, but we have created now some models that will predict the properties of a blend based on the properties of the raw materials. And that also saves a lot of time. So this is an example of a performance database. This is the variability in the feed rate coming out of a K-tron KT20, one of the most common feeders that has been used for this. For, I believe there are 14 different materials here. And what we do is we change the screw speed from 0% to 100%, and we characterize the variability. And what we learn is that, very interestingly, if your screw speed, your drive command, is about 37% to about 88% in this range, we always observe the lowest variation in flow rate. Yeah? Regardless of the material properties. And that's very useful because this leads to a very quick design criterion. I want to choose a feeder that will be in this range because I know that that's where I get the lowest variation in the mass flow rate. There are many more of these kind of rules that we have created. I don't have time to cover all of them. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what a performance database is. We show only 14 powders here, but we have several hundred of these data sets that allow us to then build models that will predict, okay, if I have a powder like this, with these flow properties, and I put it in this feeder, what am I going to see? And that has allowed us to reduce the time it takes to specify the feeder from a couple of weeks to about a day. So then comes the fourth step. Put everything together, right? Integrate the line, the physical line, select and validate the measurement systems, and basically validate the behavior of the PAT in the line, right? Identify the data streams that you're going to use. It's not just PAT. You're also going to use the flow rate. You're going to use the compaction force. You're going to use the feed frame speed. You're going to use the blender speed. All of this, the feeder gives you a lot of data. So data from the equipment and data from the sensors, put it all together. And so you can create your analytical procedure, right? And then you incorporate the sensors and the in-process controls into an overall integrated process model. That's not required, but it's very useful so that you have the ability to monitor your material properties, your process parameters, and your product quality. Yeah? Only after you've done this, you run that integrated DOE with all the different variables together because you want to have the PAT in place before you run the DOE to design the product and the process. And I want to emphasize something I mentioned in passing that is very important. The PAT methods need to be developed in the line that you're going to use for manufacturing under the intended manufacturing conditions. You cannot develop your chemometrics on the bench and assume that it's going to work on the line because most of the time it will not work. What you want is to have the sensor in the line running at the intended flow rate close to the composition that you intend to use, and that's when you run your calibration sets for your PAT. Otherwise, many failures. Okay, here's a picture showing a Raman spectrometer in a feed frame. This is an advanced near IR spectrometer. This is an Indatec spectrometer with an acquisition rate of 0.3 milliseconds, right? So it gets 300 spectra per second. And this kind of technology allows us to, among other things, collect spectra from every single tablet coming out of the tablet press. Yeah? when you have that type of data acquisition, you can average many spectra to improve the quality of your measurement. So for example, you can do things like I show you here. These are data sets. I'm sure some of you have seen many data sets like this. This is the composition distribution observed for different blends. What I want you to see here is, this is a product without API, and next to it, I have a distribution for a product with 0.3% API, and another one here with 0.9% API, and we achieve complete separation of the signal for fractions much lower than 1%. 5 years ago, people thought the threshold for applying PAT to blends is about 1.5%. Below that, I cannot really see anything. We've been able to go 10 times lower. And that's because of the advanced sensors, yes? And you can see here that there is very good correlation and very good separation between the data sets. There's basically no overlap here between groups, okay? So moving on, you examine the performance of your system. That's where you do the DOE. That's where you find the CMAs and the CPPs and the CQAs. And you run a DOE to understand how the CMAs and CPPs affect your CQAs. Yeah? This is FDA language, right? This, basically quality by design, which I believe they borrow from a lot of the things developed in Japan for many industries here, right? Then Americans discover again quality by design. So thank you very much, because you guys did a lot of very good work in this area. Determine the feasible space, and this allows you to understand the interactions between the process and the material to control product quality. Yeah? So here you have again the line, you see the material moving. So what do you do with this kind of thing? So for example, my feeder, when I refill my feeder, I might see a little jump in what's coming out of the feeder, because you refill it, there is more weight now, so the feeder was operating in open loop while I refill it. So my question is going to be, from a quality control perspective, is this going to make me fail product? Right? Depends on how tight is the spec. But I can use a technique called the Resenstein distribution to predict how that blip, becomes something else as it goes forward and it gets dispersed by the blender, and so I can compare my predicted peak to my spec, to my acceptance criterion, which is up here, and say, this little speed bump is small, my system can handle it, because the blender will give me a broader signal, will spread over that variation, and it will be within spec. Or not. It's possible that this is a lot bigger, and now my model would say, no, you will fail some product, or you will come close to failing some product. And not only I know what that curve looks like, I also know when it's going to show up, because that's what the Resenstein distribution tells you. It tells you how it's going to be spread and when it's going to move through the system. So I say, okay, between this time point and this time point, I will send the tablets to scrap, and I will keep what I was making before, and I will keep what I make after. Yeah? And that's called Resenstein distribution-based quality control. It has become the most common way to control quality. Now, I want to talk about one more quality control exercise, which is to create models of the dissolution profile. The dissolution, the release profile depends on the formulation, depends on the kind of formulation, but there are certain parameters that we know can be important, right? The size of the API particles, how much API do I have, the concentration of lubricants, concentration of disintegrants, there are wetting agents, etc. But for a given formulation, not all of these parameters will be important. And if I can design the formulation, I can design it so that very few of these parameters are important. I want to repeat that. We can design formulations where we control the release profile using a small number of parameters. And if I do that, then I can run a DOE for dissolution. Yes? where I only vary those parameters that control the solution to make 8, 10, 12 different tablets. And for those 10, 12 tablets, I measure the spectrum, and I also measure the tablet density, I measure the tablet hardness, whatever else might be important. And then I take all those tablets and I do the dissolution test. So now I have a family of tablets with different dissolution behaviors and with different spectral signals. Once I created this data, I establish a correlation between the PAT information and the dissolution information. I create the model. And once I have the model, you can bring me a new tablet. I can measure this and I can say, this tablet is going to dissolve like that. We've done this about 10 times for different formulations. Here is, people keep asking me, so here is a 24-hour dissolution profile for a polyethylene matrix, PEO matrix, very commonly used for opioids. And you can, or maybe you can't, see the prediction and the data because they go right on top of each other. Okay? It's very feasible to do this. We have done this. It has been incorporated into filings, and companies are doing this because once you predict the solution, you can predict all the CQAs. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but in the meantime, we want to talk about how to design and implement the whole control architecture for your system. You have to specify what are your control loops, which control loops depend on which, what kind of controllers are you going to use, right? There are different kinds of controllers. What controller parameters do you need to determine, right? And then you have to implement it, and then you have to run the system under control to see how well it works, so that you can implement what we think is the next major milestone, which is real-time quality control. The PAT methodology has evolved to the point where it is possible to perform measurements on every single product unit individually. And if you can measure or predict weight, hardness, composition, and dissolution, you can in practice control the quality of every single product unit. Yeah? So we have implemented real-time quality control, and we have decided that all of our measurements will take place in the tablet press. And the reason why we do all the measurements in the tablet press is that then I can implement this real-time quality control when the material is coming from a continuous blender, but I can also do it when it's coming from a batch blender. And my residence time distribution is the residence time distribution between the measurement point in the feed frame and the tablet diversion point. So I only need an RTD here to control this aspect. I will have an RTD of the rest of the line if I want to control composition, but just to exercise this kind of quality control is one step that's very easy to do. And here is the proof that we can predict dissolution. This is for one tablet, and this is for 860 tablets, all of them reaching Q point spec. And this is the comparison between the prediction and the measurement that we did afterwards to verify. So this is possible. You have to design your process and design your formulation to make this easier. You want your ingredients to have orthogonal signals relative to each other so that you can distinguish them. You know, you want a relatively simple set of mechanisms that control release, but it's possible. Now, we've done this on solid dose, but we've also done this in API manufacturing, where you have a first set of dispensing, pumping, mixing, going into one reactor, then more materials coming in, going into a second reactor, and then your chromatographic separation or whatever purification you're using, and then you have a diversion step where you keep the good product, throw away the bad product, and you can implement your feed forward and your feedback control methods. In feed forward, if I know that I'm not yet delivering steady state composition, I want to get rid of all of that. So I'm saying to the system going forward, dispense of that, get rid of that. Or maybe I can run my reactor in a different way so I can still make some API, depends on the system. My feedback control is when I'm measuring here and saying, oops, you know, we had too much of an impurity or we don't have enough of a reactant, so we go back and tell the system, give me more of this, give me less of that, increase the temperature so that I make better product. We've also done it for continuous manufacturing of liquid products and most importantly, injectable products, where again, we dispense, ultrafilter, compound, sterilize, and fill finish. Yeah? And I'm very proud that we're doing this project in collaboration with CIMIC, initially funded by FDA, now funded by the United States DARPA organization. So I'm almost at the end. I hope I have 5 more minutes here, because I want to talk a little bit about why we haven't done enough of this. Why aren't more companies doing this? And very, very particularly, why aren't generic companies doing any of this? Because even though for branded companies, speed to market is the most important thing, for generics, speed to market is super important, but in addition to that, the unit cost of production for generics is very, very important, right? And we can lower the unit cost of production. So why aren't generics doing more? I think the answer has to do with a few factors. The first factor is that there is still a relatively small number of people who have the actual practical knowledge of how to do this, including a lot of the senior managers, right? So it's hard when you don't have the expertise to feel confident that you can get to the end line, that you can get all the way to an approval. Yeah. So I think there is a culture and issue, and there is a training issue. Those are very important, and we've been talking all week about how to help address that problem. Yeah. So that makes it difficult to create an implementation plan. Now, we have actually worked with generic companies that have been able to succeed. Okay, we have one company particularly in China, for which we created the continuous manufacturing process, created the formulation, went with them to the equipment suppliers, helped them buy the right equipment, develop the PAT methods, and they were able to go the full way because we work very closely with them, right? There's another factor, which is that you have to put a fair amount of money up front. Yeah? Altogether, it's probably in the order of 20 to 30 million US to get a line up and running, fully integrated, fully qualified, fully operational. And that includes the cost of the hardware, the cost of the facility, and the cost of the people. Yeah? And I think it's a reasonable estimate. So if you're in a generic company, the other factor that is also important is that, and this has been a very common experience, from the point when you decide we want to go into continuous manufacturing, and then you select the product you're going to make, and then you select the manufacturing process you're going to use, and then you wait for a year to get your equipment, and then you wait for another year or year and a half to integrate and qualify, and then you have your system operational, but you develop several months developing your formulation and your process, and then you file, and then you have to wait another year to get an approval from regulators. Our estimate is that this is anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And we talked to several companies here in Japan that validated this timeline. It takes that long. We have seen this timeline. When we first worked with J&J, it took this long. We started in 2010, the approval happened in 2016. So it's a long time to wait. So the question is, how do we reduce the cost, and how do we accelerate the timeline? And how do we provide trained people? If we can do those 3 things, I believe we make it much easier to do that. So how do we do that? Well, we have a strategy which assumes the following, that we have already created the hardware system. We have already implemented a continuous line for development and a continuous line that is basically identical for manufacturing. And we have the people there with the expertise, right? So we call that the tech center, where we can develop the process, and the CMO can take over from us and make the product. And the timeline is completely different. Yeah? You come to us with your materials and you tell us, Fernando, can you create a product and a process for us? And we can do it in 2 to 3 months. We've done it many times. Yeah? And then basically, once we've done that, we can transfer that to our GMP partner, and they can make the clinical supplies. And that doesn't need to take more than a few weeks. So these are conservative timelines. Yes? So if the company wants to have their own equipment, right here, they could be ordering the equipment, yeah? While in parallel with that, we complete the process development, do the stability testing, this is what takes longest here, and file, right? You do the clinical supplies, and do the stability testing, and file. So within 15 to 18 months, maybe 24, the filing has happened. And it can be faster than that. Yeah? And in parallel with that, you can order your equipment, receive it, integrate it, qualify it, and then be ready to operate. So we can cut the timeline in at least half, maybe better. Yeah? We can also greatly decrease the cost. This portion of the work, because the lines are already there, will cost 3 to 6 million instead of 30. And this can be entirely optional because the CMO can make the product. And so you don't need to necessarily build your own line. I think we're going to see a strong move towards consolidation of continuous manufacturing operations at a few companies that have the fully integrated systems and can make product for everybody else. While at the company, a lot of this work will happen using essentially identical lines. Which brings me to the next and final point. It would be very good if we're all working with very similar equipment. Because then tech transfer is much faster and much lower risk, right? So eventually we will evolve towards 2 or 3 standard platforms that everybody is sharing, right? I envision CMOs having maybe 2 or 3 platforms, and then the companies develop products choosing one of those platforms, but the CMO is ready to implement that platform. Or the tech center has those same 2 or 3 platforms and can support the work, having already the expertise in place. We are beginning to implement this methodology. I think that in the next few months, we're going to implement many more aspects of this methodology and be ready to support companies that really want to do this quickly. Okay? To me, that is the answer to this problem of the timeline and the cost. Yeah? You can reduce the upfront cost very significantly. You can reduce the time to market at least by half. Yeah? While at the same time, you're supporting the work using people that have all the necessary training, have all the necessary knowledge. And here's the other thing. We can do this in the tech center and this in the CMO with the client personnel present there the entire time. So that knowledge transfer is efficient, and at the end of this process, the company gets back people that have been fully trained and also know how their own product and process were developed. We've done this too. When we were doing the J&J projects, we had J&J engineers there. We have had Vertex engineers in our facility. We are 20 minutes from Merck. We're half an hour from Pfizer. So we do this a lot. Yes? Okay. So the partnership between Rutgers and CIMIC is coming together. It's very important. And I think is a very significant collection of capabilities that have come together. It's strategic because I think for the first time, we have an academic institution doing the non-GMP work while the commercial manufacturer is doing the GMP work, but we're in the same building. Let me show you where we are. I'll come back there. So this is the CIMIC building in New Jersey. The blue areas, these are our offices, our R&D labs, and our QC labs. The rest of the building is all CIMIC. Yeah? So with this capability, we interact pretty much every day. We can share personnel. We can share our networks of people, government, industry, and we can provide the necessary training and support to CIMIC and to others to really be able to move forward with confidence and be able to provide absolutely the best services in this area. This partnership has been endorsed by our government. This person here is Philip Murphy, Governor of New Jersey, who actually came to visit Japan almost a year ago. Yes? And I think you know this gentleman, and I think you know this gentleman. These are Mac and TK, who are here today, participating in what was the signing of the memorandum of understanding that established the partnership between Rutgers University and CIMIC prior to us moving into their building. Yeah? So I think this will allow us to enable a different future in continuous manufacturing. You remember my picture? So if we build material property database and process models, we can achieve predictive material performance. With this, we can predict how the material is going to work in the system. And we can also specify material properties that we need. We can create meaningful material specifications. What kind of flow properties do I need? What kind of electrical properties do I need? What particle size do I need? Yes? Right now, we're working in shadows. We measure properties for consistency's sake, but we don't really have implemented. We have not implemented acceptance ranges that are meaningful to the process. We can do that once we have created these tools. If we actually add sensors and process control to this, we can now do predictive process design. And if we integrate correctly, we can achieve optimization in process performance, optimization in product quality, and maximum profit. And I think that when we achieve this at a sufficient scale, we will have a very different paradigm for pharmaceutical manufacturing. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope to have a few questions.